Welcome to a deeper dive with me and today's special guest, Al Cardenas. He is a former chairman of the Republican Party of Florida, a co-founder of the American Business Immigration Coalition, and a former chairman of the American Conservative Union. Please join us. We're going to talk all things MAGA, Republicans, Democrats, no labels, you name it, we got it.
We're living with a lot of theater now that's not as meaningful as the politics it represents.
You're listening to A Deeper Dive with Dara, a podcast by the News Service of Florida.
Hello and welcome to A Deeper Dive with me, Dara Cam. I am really excited to have another one of my OGs here with me today, virtually, not here in the Terracotta Room. A special guest, Al Cardenas. He is a former chairman of the Republican Party of Florida, the co-chair of the American Business Immigration Coalition, and a former chairman of the American Conservative Union. Thank you so much for joining us today. Should I call you chairman or should I just call you Al?
Whatever you prefer.
I call you chairman. Once a chairman, always a chairman. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Good to be with you there. And congratulations on this podcast series.
Thank you. We're having a lot of fun with it. So I'm really thrilled that you could join us today. We go way back to the Jeb Bush days. So when I say one of my OGs, I'm serious. Let's just jump right into it. We're recording this a few days after Governor Ron DeSantis announced he's getting out of the 2024 race for president. Let's talk about that a little bit. A lot of I've been reading and people have been sending to me, and they keep coming. The hits keep coming. All these autopsies of the, and this is not Dara saying this, but the worst presidential campaign ever. I think your friend, are you friends with Alex Castellanos? Or
yes.
Yeah. I mean, that was quite they pulled no punches in that op-ed they did for Politico. So I was wondering what your thoughts are, not just on the campaign, but what's next for Florida? What is him dropping out of the race mean for Florida? And also feel free to weigh in on, give us your autopsy.
Yeah, well, with regards to the autopsy, it was a campaign fraught with problems. One poor strategy to try to sneak in on the MAGA base that is fully dedicated to Donald Trump like a cult, to me was a challenge. That to me was an impenetrable wall, and no matter what he said or did, it wasn't going to work. His comments that, hey, I don't have any problems like he does, but we're the same flavor of ice cream. Well, people want the real thing, and he found out soon enough that his message resonated with the MAGA base, but they already had a leader. They didn't have room for two. So that was one. The second one was he proved not to be a very liked campaigner. His personality is not given to a national scene or a national platform. He didn't do well in those forums. In Florida, he was able to control the forums, exclude the media, talk only to friendly audiences. Nationally, you enter into a different marketplace, and you're competing with others who are also qualified. And so he didn't do well in the arena of being liked. And the question I always thought people cared for the most is, does that people care for people like me? And does that candidate care for what I care about? And he didn't score too well in that category, which had mostly to do with likelihood. So those were his challenges, and the outcome was pretty much predetermined before Iowa. He spent a lot of money in Iowa. He traveled all 99 counties, and he didn't win a single one. And so, obviously, that told the story. In my
Yeah.
sense, because I've seen this movie many times before, the donors didn't return calls. The staff started sending out resumes to other people, and it was a foregone conclusion.
I mean, it was just a hot mess from the get go, really, as people have noted. The launch on Twitter was maybe foreshadowed what was to come, with all the technical problems and, the likability. It's always, people always say the candidate who you want to have a beer with. And I guess apparently, not that many people wanted to have a beer with Ron DeSantis. The danger, I think, of bragging so much about how you hit all 99 counties is what happened to him, and not winning any of them. That I think maybe punctuated the loss because they had made such a big deal out of traveling to all of those counties.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, the big question now, of course, is he's a young man. He's governor. He's got 2 years left on his term. What's next? And, can he rehabilitate the, the backward steps he took in a failed presidential race? And we'll see. I don't know how to predict that. I don't know how to forecast what his future may look like. I do know he's got to do a lot of repair work, and it begins at home. And if he doesn't do a good job, or if he insists on being the ultimate leader in Florida, I don't know what's going to happen down the ballot in some of these contested races in Florida in 24. We'll see what happens.
As you said, you've been to these rodeos before. I think we're in kind of a new era in politics, though. I think Trump, am I right? I mean, Trump kind of broke the Republican Party in some ways. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yes, that was an accurate assessment for, I guess, the past 7 or 8 years. Can that cult remain in charge of the Republican Party? And will MAGA continue to be the majority of the Republican Party? That's a great question. One of the speculations is that if Nikki Haley continues in this journey, she's demonstrating that there's a solid 40-some% of the Republican base that doesn't feel like it wants to join MAGA, that feels very differently. And the results of these exit polls are really interesting. Like the exit polls in New Hampshire showed that 87% of those who voted for Trump feel like Joe Biden didn't legally win the presidency. Only 18% of those who voted for Nikki Haley felt the same way. I mean, that disparity is just amazing. And probably more than any other test delineates the difference between MAGA Republicans and traditional Republicans. And so the question is, can Nikki Haley build the traditional Republican base to the point where he can truly compete with MAGA in a number of these states? And that'll have to do a lot with down ballot primaries for Congress and for the state legislature. So we'll see where that goes.
I always say this. I love when my guests get to the questions that I was going to ask before I ask them. I wanted to add one of my questions lower down on my list, but let's go there now. Two things I want to ask you about is what these races and the down ballot races in November. But before we get there, what does it tell you about your part? Are you still a Republican, by the way?
I am.
Okay.
I am
What does it tell you about your party that so many of them don't believe that President Biden won the election fairly? How do you interpret that data that you just gave me?
Well, people are generally followers. I always give the example of Germany and Japan in World War II. And the conversation I had with President Bush, the father, George H.W. Bush, talking about going to Japan as a vice president, having this surreal experience, meeting with a strong ally who, in his own generation, in his own lifetime, he almost lost his life to in the bomber he was flying.
Right.
And so here you have this incredible enemy of the United States, fierce enemy, who was willing to commit these suicide plane flights, feeling so strongly about, the Japanese goals of winning. Same thing with Germany, and yet today, within his own generation and within the generation still of some Americans, those two are two of our strongest allies. And so my point in that whole conversation is that people are generally followers. For some reason, Trump's anger and divisiveness and appeal to lower instincts hit home with a number of Americans for a whole variety of reasons, right? As many reasons were cultural, many reasons were fear instilled in their hearts. But whatever it is, the cult exists. Can that cult be reversed? Sure. Just look at Japan and look at Germany, and those traces of what led them to that war in World War II are no longer there in the vast majority of the population. And my sense is that MAGA will not wear well in the long term, and that Americans will, be a center left, center right country in some time to come. I don't know if it's 5 years, 10 years, but these cycles don't last forever. And I don't think that fear and hate can last forever either.
That could take a generation. You're saying 5 or 10 years. I think that might be optimistic. I'm not usually I'm kind of a glass half empty kind of gal. If you know my origin story, you know why. But if you don't, you don't need to know it. But, it does seem... I don't like to disasterize or catastrophize where we are as a nation, Chairman. My father served in the military. He's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. And while many conservatives who know me might think that you might not know it, I am a patriot, a true patriot. And I have concerns I share concerns, I should say, about where we are headed as a nation, as the kind of governance structure that we are going to end up with under a possible second term of President Trump. Am I going to get, am I going to be on everyone's do not call or do not respond to list by saying that out loud? As journalists, do we need to pretend like that's not something that we care about? I don't know. I'm just saying out loud what many people are thinking privately.
Well, here's a missing voice in American politics, and where I think the press doesn't do generally a good enough job. We were in New Hampshire covering. I was covering New Hampshire for CNN, and the numbers there were pretty clear. There's 30% of the voters were Republican, 30% of voters were Democrat, and 39% were independent. And we spend our time talking about Republicans and Democrats. And they control the primaries, they control the candidates on the ballot. But, there was a time when I started politics in Florida where independents were less than 8%. And now the number is in the 30s also in Florida. And so How much time do we spend covering independents? Very little, because they don't offer candidates on the ballot. There are not a lot of interesting stories to tell. But the one hope that I have is that the majority of American voters don't care for either party. And that's a rejection that's visible in the voter registration. The question is, how do you empower the majority of the voters who now are not are disenfranchised? They can't vote in primaries. They don't have a say on who appears in the ballot, and therefore, in America, that was 50% center left, center right in Congress. Just 20 years ago, is now 10% center right, center left, and it's controlled primarily by people whose philosophical leanings are to the far left or the far right. But in reality, most of America is still in the center, not just who it's just not who represents them. And so I have faith based on the growing numbers of independents. And the big question there of how do we fix the problems that we have today and the toxic and the toxic environment is how do we enfranchise those independent voters so that they have a say in primaries before names go on the ballot. And we tried crossover voting in Florida,
Yeah.
and it just barely lost. I mean, it got over 50% of the vote, but not that new 60% threshold that we've done in Florida.
Right.
So obviously, the appetite by a majority of the voters in Florida was to have crossover voting, and it should continue to be the case. But the legislature will never put that on the ballot, and getting to 60% is pretty hard. So we'll see what happens with that. But somehow, some way, a pressure valve is going to explode because you can't have continuously the number one voting bloc, which are independents, be totally out of the picture until the general elections. And so, to me, that's the best antidote to the toxic atmosphere that is presented by both parties.
So, what about the possibility of a no labels or a third party? A lot of people in both parties think that these are just, spoilers. If these independent candidates enter big races, they're going to hurt. Probably, I think people are saying the Democrats. I don't know. Maybe this year it could be different. But what do you think about the possibility that the U.S. really does, that we do have a third party or an independent party, or if it's not a formal party, that there is space in politics? I mean, real election space, not just space to talk, for people who aren't in the Democratic or Republican parties.
Yeah, well, the solution is pretty simple. Obviously, those voices need to be heard. The challenge is not the solution. The challenge is getting there because, as you know, becoming a political party is driven not nationally but by each state, and each state has their own rules and regulations. And frankly, neither party, whether you're in the minority or the majority, wants to give a third party an option. And that will always be the case. And so, what No Labels is doing, forgetting a presidential ticket and forgetting for a second its impact on the outcome of a presidential race. What they're doing in qualifying, they're now qualified in 13, 14 states. What they're doing, I think, is a good thing. It's giving an entry point to people who want to run under a third alternative. And that's just not for president. It could be for anything. It could be for a statewide office, could be for Congress, for the state legislature. I think the time has come where maybe that's a good idea. And it's going to be strongly opposed by those who are either Democrats or Republican office holders because, why would they let a third party spoiler make their life more complicated? And so I'm thinking, that's where America is now, unless the parties get back to their traditional selves and are able to get this toxic atmosphere to simmer down. And but it's not easy. It's not easy to qualify. and maybe instead of projecting as a third party alternative, by putting all that energy into a presidential ticket, no labels is taking away a lot of the goodwill that they were building up by creating an opportunity for alternatives to be on the ballot.
Mm.
Because, as you said, everybody's now attacking them, thinking that they're going to negatively impact their presidential candidate. But if no labels all of a sudden said we're not participating in the presidential race, I think they'd win a lot of converts on the idea of creating a third alternative.
I think, there it does seem where when the extreme factions of the parties have, and I don't necessarily think that President Biden represents the extreme faction in the Democratic Party, but
I agree.
right. So he is more of a centrist. So I think that even in our recent history, we can demonstrate that there is space on the political spectrum for center left, center right candidates to be elected. In Florida, I'm not sure that's the case anymore. I think that we are kind of an outlier. I think that's also, not just Dara again thinking, but many people believe that part of the problem that Governor DeSantis had was trying to take the Florida model and imprint it nationally. It doesn't. Florida is an outlier. Florida is going to be Florida. Florida is going to Florida. So I'm not sure that what our experiences are here really translate state by state, especially given that we are kind of like, we used to be 3 states. I think now we're kind of 5 states in Florida. You know what I mean? Like you can't really use us as a template.
Yeah, I mean, Florida probably has a higher level of toxic atmosphere than most places. But that's a recent phenomenon. I think Florida's legislative product used to be fairly center right till about 8 years ago, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's slowly gotten more to the far right as a result of the political aspirations of people and the willingness of elected leaders to follow blindly those they think control their future. And when you think about it, I mean, this governor has had enormous power, and when he endorses somebody, usually they've been winning. So for the last 6 years, Governor DeSantis has been to the state of Florida what Donald Trump has been to the GOP nationally. He has been very successful in dominating the marketplace. Whether that power continues to exist after this presidential effort remains to be seen. As long as he can determine the likelihood of somebody winning a primary, that's an enormous amount of power. And that means that his followers will follow whatever edicts he wants to propose, regardless of how controversial they may be, whether it's book censorship or a very strict abortion law, or whether it's whatever. I mean, we're living with a lot of theater now that's not as meaningful as the politics it represents, uh, like the immigration proposals in the state. But it is theater, and people seem to be moving in that direction. We'll see. The 24 elections will tell a lot about whether we're still in the high ground of far right politics in Florida, or whether we're being more measured in the outcome. So we'll see.
What do you think in the 2024 elections? What do you think the outcome is going to be? Do you think the Republicans will hold on to the House and Congress? And do you think that they will take over the Senate?
Well, there are going to be 8 to 10 seats in the House that are going to be decided by 1 or 2 points. That's always the case. And the Republicans did really well in winning most of the purple seats in the state in the last election, which
Mm-hmm.
was a runaway. As a result of Republicans having more resources, having momentum, and frankly, Democrats doing a lousy job. In the last presidential election in Florida, Democrats nationally didn't put any money into the race. Democrats put very little, if any, money in the race in 2022. And so it all depends on them, frankly. If Joe Biden does well in Florida, he doesn't have to win, but he's got to have a very close race. If the Democrats decide to pour some money into these statewide races and maybe those purple seats, then the Democrats can make a comeback. They're not going to, in one election cycle, become the majority in either the Senate or the House,
Right.
but they can narrow the margins, and by narrowing margins, have a say. But that remains to be seen. Really, it's up to them. It's up to Joe Biden to do okay here in Florida. It's up to the National Party to put money in the state, which they haven't done the last two cycles, in order to be competitive.
And we'll be right back with Al Cardenas.
Here at Deeper Dive, we want to hear from you, the listeners. We invite you to send your questions, comments, and feedback to our mailbag. You can reach us at deeperdive@cityandstatefl.com. That's deeperdive@cityandstatefl.com. Get your 2 cents in by sending us an email.
Welcome back to A Deeper Dive with Dara. Yeah, I mean, it's almost like at some point we felt like it seemed as though the national Democrats had given up, thrown up their hands and given up on Florida. We just had a special election in Central Florida. A Democrat took a seat that was held by a Republican who left office because he was appointed to as the head of a state college. So that was kind of, I think that gives
and the mayor's race in Jacksonville impressed me even more.
That was huge.
Because Jacksonville, it's a hotbed of conservative thought. And that was even a bigger upset, I think, than the election in Central Florida.
I think you're absolutely right, because it is a very red part of the state.
So the answer is, if you put in a decent candidate, if you put in resources and you try hard, they can make gains. But it's up to them. As you said, they kind of threw the white flag and have been non-competitive the last two cycles. So they've got to figure that out. And the challenge is that 80% of the resources go to the 8 states that will determine the outcome of the presidential race. And to convince Democrats that Florida should receive a significant amount of resources when it's not now considered one of the 8 states that are key to the presidential election is a tough call.
I wanted to talk about, ask you your thoughts about Democrats and Hispanic voters, because they keep, for many, many years, I heard Democratic leaders in Florida talking about targeting Hispanic voters, and they has been kind of a sore spot for people in the Black community, that their votes were just sort of they were taken for granted. they weren't courted, And I'm wondering, you mentioned some of the, I think you alluded to the congressional races down in South Florida, where the Republicans have been so good at messaging, targeting Hispanics in the Miami-Dade area particularly. Is there any way for the Democrats to break through to Hispanics down there in the 305?
Yeah, good question, obviously. And I don't have a magic wand to predict anything, but there are a number of factors that have led to this happening. One factor is the fact that, we have a growing middle class in the Hispanic community nationally. More small businesses have been opened by Hispanics the last 10 years than by anybody else. And the amount of middle class Hispanics has doubled in the last 10 years. And yet the Democrats' message is still primarily civil injustice uh, and and immigration. And frankly, I'm all for that. But that growing Hispanic middle class wants to hear the same messages all center right, center left people in America want to hear, and that is, hey, how about my taxes? How about inflation? How about this or that? So I think Democrats are still using the old guard messaging, which is no longer as effective. Number two, the Democrats, in my opinion, have missed out on financing these elections the way that they should, or targeting them. And the Republican Party's put a lot more money into these races, and so from a effort point of view, the Republicans have done better than the Democrats. The third aspect of it is the fact that the Republican Party is now being followed by evangelicals. And there's been a significant growth in the evangelical community. Most Hispanics used to be Catholic. Now, a significant percentage have converted to the evangelical churches who carry a lot of weight. I mean, there's some evangelical churches in Miami that have 10,000 parishioners.
Mm.
And so they have, the leaders of those churches have been appealed to and have become Republicans because of abortion or because of social issues, and feel that maybe the Democrats are too liberal when it comes to social issues. And so my sense is if you combine those three factors, that's the reason. But Democrats still outnumber, Democrat Hispanics still outnumber Republican Hispanics, and it's a matter of messaging to a center right, center left audience rather than to a social justice audience. And it's also a factor of resources and doing what you need to do and convincing evangelical leaders that you're not the enemy. I mean, there are now evangelical radio stations that have a pretty significant listening audience in the Hispanic radio community. So those are the reasons, in my opinion.
And also, you can't wait until 6 weeks, even 8 weeks before the general election to start doing your outreach.
Well said. Well said. If you counted the number of times that Donald Trump and his surrogates came to Miami compared to Joe Biden and his surrogates in the last presidential election, no wonder their results were where they were. People like to be loved. They like to be touched, and Democrats didn't do a good job of that.
Yeah. Well, we'll see if President Biden and his surrogates come to Florida very often. I don't see that in my crystal ball, but I could be wrong. Let's talk about immigration. You were very outspoken critic, you and Mike Fernandez, with your group, the American Business Immigration Coalition, and as individuals, critical of efforts that the legislature has passed over the past couple of years. Just for lack of, for shorthand, I'll say cracking down on illegal immigration, or attempting to crack down on illegal immigration. We've seen Governor DeSantis has made this a major issue. The flights of the migrants from Texas to Martha's Vineyard, that you talk about theater. I think that some might paint that as theater. Now it is against the law to be transporting someone who is in the country. I'm stumbling as I say it because I want to say, like, is in the country, is an undocumented immigrant, but I'm not even sure that it doesn't go farther than that. So maybe you can help me understand it. But, there are people in the immigrant community who believe that these types of laws have demonized migrants and immigrants who make up a substantial part of Florida's economy and contribute in many ways to our economy, not the least of which is in the field of agriculture. What are your thoughts about where we are as a state and the way that immigrants are being spoken about and treated in Florida?
Yeah, well, that's a lot of theater, as you mentioned. And frankly, quite a bit of the legislature passing of laws, those laws have been deemed unconstitutional. I think we spent 15, $20 million in lawyers in Florida,
Mm-hmm.
losing 4 or 5 cases in court
Mm-hmm.
uh, for laws that we adopted that we should have known better, would not pass constitutional muster. So that's one issue. But overall, look, our organization is made up of heads of big businesses in either farming or hospitality and in other areas that require significant labor. We're short in America 5 to 10 million workers, and we're short in the areas that are pretty essential to Florida: hospitality, farming, nursing, healthcare, the areas that are really hurting for labor, and we can't. I mean, we're just short of people, and we have the people in the states, and who can be employed, and if we do at least an employer-based immigration system where employers can hire people that don't have a work permit but can get a work permit if offered a job by an employer
Mm-hmm.
that meets, that meets due diligence standards, we can at least begin to solve some of the big issues in Florida that are challenging, and that's a labor shortage. So
Right.
that kind of initiative.
Or let me interrupt you. Or we can just relax our child labor laws so that we have more kids working.
Yeah, well, that's pretty sad to go back to that. So
Yeah.
my point to you is that we were formed for the purposes of telling America, look, we've got 10 million or more people in America who, whether they're dreamers, whether they're farm workers, whether they're whatever, that are part of this gray or black economy and subterranean economy, and some don't even try to do that. But it's a burden in our country that could become a real asset, and we just don't have the political fortitude to do it right because we've been demonizing immigration for so long for political gain that we can't do the right thing. We haven't had immigration reform since Ronald Reagan almost 40 years ago. So we need to mature as a country, and that's what ABIC is all for. And inflation was at its peak. We were trying to get a bill to provide work permits. This is work permits, not citizenship and not
Mm-hmm.
residency, but work permits to those people that could work the field so we could reduce the cost of food. But even that didn't fly. In the height of inflation and the height of need, just because Congress will not pass anything that diminishes their targeting immigrants as part of their solution. And if you look at the polling numbers in Iowa and New Hampshire, it seems to be working. Sadly, I mean, immigration is almost in par with the economy as the two most significant issues for Republican primary voters. And so very few Republicans are going to do anything to diminish what they consider to be a political advantage heading
Right.
to the general election. So I'm not very optimistic. I do know that a lot of the punitive stuff we passed in Florida uh, is not really acceptable. I think it'll backfire. I don't know to what extent, but it's certainly not helping Republicans in the general election coming up. But as I said, once Hispanics get to the middle class, these issues are less significant than they used to be some years back.
Right, they're more pocketbook issues, right? It's so. Um, I wouldn't be remiss if and thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. We could go on for hours. I hope you'll come back again soon. But I would be remiss if we didn't talk about the RPOF, the Republican Party of Florida, your former chair. There's been a lot of press lately about who is now the previous chair of the party, Christian Ziegler, and investigations regarding allegations about his personal life.
Yeah, you're going to make me cry. In all the years that I spent building up the party so we could become the majority party in Florida, effort that I started in the 80s and culminated in our becoming a majority party when I was chairman. I'm seeing one of my successors under Charlie Crist go to jail.
Right.
I'm seeing the scandal with Ziegler. I've seen the Republican Party, just disbanded when it comes to its effectiveness, to a point where now the Senate and the House run their own campaigns, raise their own funds. Their funds are not handled within the Republican Party. They're handled separately. The Republican Party has a hard time paying its own bills. The headquarters, which under my chairmanship, we bought and paid for.
I'm looking at the chair. I'm looking at the headquarters from my office, from the terracotta room right now as we speak, by the way.
Well, if you go inside, you'll see how a state of disrepair it's in.
Oh, wow.
And, the party hasn't raised enough funds to do any of the basic things.
Wow.
I don't know if they'll have enough funds to do any get out the vote, which is an essential part of a political party's responsibility. The office is a place that people won't go to anymore. The House and Senate are looking about their own office space. So I'm sad about what's happened to the party. I'm not too sure that is solvable at this time. There are many other priorities that the party ought to have, but it's just not the same thing.
What suggestions would you give the current chairman, Evan Power, about bringing the party together and unifying, or would you bother?
Well, the first thing he's got to do is recruit a finance committee and see who's willing to serve and give them a sense of purpose that would be persuasive. And I would come up with a plan. Here's what we're going to do to register voters to get out the vote, and here's the budget, and you guys ought to be part of the finance committee and help me do it, and you'll have a say on how we spend the money. Maybe that's a way he can begin to, make some ground, but I don't know. I don't know if there's going to be an appetite by donors to get involved in that mess.
But I should have given you credit because you were at the helm of the party at the time when the Democrats, this was the shift took place under your watch. The movement from Democratic control. We had the first House Republican speaker, I think, since Reconstruction under your watch, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
So
2 years later, the Senate.
And 2 years later, the Senate, and now ironclad control over both chambers, supermajorities in both chambers, and control, and as well as all the executive branch offices. You mentioned the party being in disrepair, but the Republicans are still outstripping Democrats in terms of voter registration. They say no more people are leaving or they aren't getting more voter. I'm not sure how that's working, but the Republican registration in Florida now exceeds by almost, I think it's more than 600,000 voters.
Without a doubt. Listen, the House leadership and the Senate leadership, to their credit, has done an outstanding job in stepping into the role of the party. And they've raised a lot of money. They've deployed those resources wisely, and they've been able to substitute the Republican Party as the entity that has, has caused a successful outcome. I mean, there's still things that a party should be able to do that's more difficult for the chambers, like voter registration and get out to vote. But at least they've recruited good candidates. They've spent money on getting those candidates elected. They've raised a lot of money. They basically supplanted the things that I and the Republican Party used to do. So they've stepped in to fill the void.
Well, again, before we go, I want to thank you again. And before we go, I want to ask you over and under. It looks like it's going to be a Trump-Biden ticket again in November. And over and under, what do you think? Who do you think's going to win?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of it will depend on what happens with the criminal justice system. Probably 30% of the Republican voters in Iowa in the exit polls said that they wouldn't vote for Trump if he was convicted of a crime. And if Nikki Haley's able to continue for a while and really develop a breach between MAGA and traditional voters, that would result in maybe those traditional Republicans not voting for Biden, but staying home. In Iowa, we had one of the lowest turnouts ever in the primary. And yeah, the weather was pretty bad, but it usually is. And so that was telling in terms of the turnout in New Hampshire was a little better, but not anywhere near close to some of the better years we've had. So we'll see. I mean, there are three risks that Republicans have in winning the White House. One is Trump's criminal record possibility. Number two, people dissatisfied with him at the top of the ticket and staying home. And number three, the efforts by Nikki Haley and how long will they last? That's why you saw Trump so upset in New Hampshire that she's decided not to leave the race. And Biden, on the other hand, his campaign's been pretty lazy. Not getting on the ballot in New Hampshire, to my opinion, was absurd. Not participating in Iowa was absurd. And I just don't see the emotional energy that's required to win re-election. His record hasn't been that bad, frankly.
Right.
And the economy normally controls the outcome of these presidential races. And we've had record numbers in the stock market. America's fully employed. I mean, he's got a lot to brag about, but for some reason, you don't see or hear it as much.
It's like you said, voters want to, it goes on both sides. Voters want to feel like they matter. They want to be seen. They want to be heard. This is why Charlie Crist was such a great politician when he was a great politician, is he made voters feel like they were cared about. I think I totally agree with you. Not showing up and is really, you can't do that nowadays. I think it's not a successful strategy. We'll see.
So my answer to you is I have no idea who's going to win because there's too much is going to be happening that will determine that. So.
Okay. Well, good. Is there any parting shots you'd like to take before we say goodbye for now?
No, I still love my party. I'm still a member of it. I'm very saddened by, the twists and turns of what's happened with this MAGA effort, but I'm trying to be in the game in order to turn it around to be the traditional party I always worked hard for. So we'll see what happens.
Well, thank you, Chairman Al Cardenas. It's been a real treat chatting with you today.
Thank you.
A Deeper Dive with Dara is hosted by Dara Cam, produced by Ryan Daly, and music for the podcast was recorded by Periodic Labs LLC and performed by Ryan Daly and Danny Reyes.